In 1984, at the midpoint of the Reagan era, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger laid out the rudiments of what came to be called the Weinberger Doctrine on the use of force by the United States in a speech to the National Press Club. The gist of it was that wars should be fought only when there is a high degree of public support for them. Wars should be fought only in the pursuit of interests that are vital to the nation. And wars should be fought to win, quickly and decisively, and in a spirit of massive commitment of effort to victory, however it was defined. You don't need the ghost-seeing eyes of a circus medium to observe the grim specter of the Vietnam War animating this particular set of foreign policy principles. The American defense establishment's memory of that near-death experience in Southeast Asia was still very live in its consciousness at that time, all the more so as by the mid-1980s it was slowly beginning to recover its sense of self-belief. If you've read General Tommy Franks' memoirs, which probably you have not, and I've read it, so I'm going to relieve you of the necessity to, you'll find a passage which describes very well the army of the 1970s, and which serves extremely well to illustrate the nadir of the American military mood to which they wished never to return. He writes, "For years these troops had seen the Army's sense of purpose deteriorate, and its tradition of discipline along with it. In fact, the whole U.S. military, and especially the Army, had been wounded in the paddies and jungles of Vietnam. Like the nation it served, the Army had begun to doubt itself. We had fought a long, costly war to a stalemate, and then had withdrawn, claiming peace with honor. Pessimism and negativism extended from the Pentagon down to the infantry rifle squads and artillery gun crews. It's hard to dismiss the pertinence of the doctrine, therefore, which indeed ultimately acquired a sort of orthodoxy in a later variant known as the Weinberger-Powell doctrine, which was championed by Colin Powell in his days as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the 1990s. Basically, Weinberger and Powell had a good point. Armies are the nation's insurance policy, and their strength is probably not best frittered away in protracted, thankless, invertebrate conflicts, as Caldwell described them long ago. Nonetheless, there were critics, both outside the establishment and within it. For the former, I very much like Edward Luttwak's critique, in which he described it this way. It's like a hospital that does not want to admit patients. Some hospital administrators want the perfect state of maximum readiness, and patients make a mess. For the latter, George Shultz, Reagan's Secretary of State, who was metaphorically speaking at war with Weinberger for the foreign policy soul of the administration, provided this acid phrase which titles my lecture. Weinberger, he said, only wanted to fight the fun wars, ignoring the fact that America's global interests were extensive and varied enough to necessitate the use of limited force in all sorts of contingencies that would never pass the conditions set out in the Weinberger Doctrine. At the root was a question, which was well put in the pages of the New York Times at that time. It said, or it asked rather, why are we wasting $100 billion a year on force we will never apply? Without the will, of what use is the muscle? Again, it's hard to dismiss the salience of the question, though I know some listeners will react angrily to it. Much as soldiers may prefer, with good reason, to be treated like one of those alarm levers in public buildings, encased under glass, labeled break only in case of emergency, and penalties apply for misuse, policymakers have multiple objectives, and they're obliged to ask these value-for-money questions about the instruments they have to hand. Shultz was by no means blind to the lessons of Vietnam. His point, rather, was that, in his own words, power and diplomacy always go together. Certainly power must always be guided by purpose, but the hard reality is that diplomacy, not backed by strength, is ineffectual. Power and diplomacy are not distinctive alternatives. They must go together, or we will accomplish very little in the world. The tension between these two poles was not resolved in Reagan's day, or in the time of his successor, George Bush the Senior. Somewhat famously, it was reprised in the first Clinton administration when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright demanded in a White House altercation with Powell, just as the Bosnian War was heating up in 1993, "What's the point of having this superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it?" she said. In his memoirs, Powell noted that the remark nearly caused him an aneurysm. In the run-up to his first election, George W. Bush, the junior that is, made it clear that his administration would pursue a distinctively Weinbergian approach to foreign affairs. As Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor-to-be, put it in a widely cited foreign affairs piece, "The president must remember that the military is a special instrument, and it is meant to be. It is not a civilian peace force, it is not a political referee, and it is most certainly not designed to build a civilian society." Nearly a decade and a half into the War on Terror, however you want to call it, the Obama administration has abjured the label, but carried on with it in substance. The irony of this statement will escape precisely no one. The truth is that the gap between war as it generally is in reality, slow, crude, politically imperfect, and war as we wish it to be, fast, precise, politically decisive, has never been larger. The West, more specifically the United States, with its major allies lining up with it for the most part, has been chasing the fun wars for 40 years and serially coming up empty. How this happened and why is not a happy story, but it is full of ingenious twists and Olympian efforts that make it interesting and I think potentially educational. Probably, I think it's a tragedy. But the conclusion hasn't been written. Perhaps someone will pull a rabbit from a hat, to mix a metaphor, but I'm doubtful. The hunt for wars that are fast, easy, and decisive has been run with quite a lot of industry and a great deal of technological inventiveness, to which the advent of the vaunted information age has contributed quite a lot. Over and over, we've substituted a strategy of gadgets for strategy full stop. And all that it has delivered so far is slow and bitter and indecisive quagmires. Under normal historical circumstances, I think a simple definition of fun war would serve to illustrate its fundamental incompatibility with reality. A fun war is a war against an opponent the contours of whose face precisely matches the dimensions of the knuckles of one's fist, and who obligingly presents this target fixedly at the distance of precisely one arm's length. The existence of such an opponent defies common sense. By and large, people are not stupid, particularly in war, which is an area in which humans are actually incredibly ingenious. It defies our most vital theory of war, which is transparently clear on the point that war is a duel of creative wills and not a contest with some mute and unreactive entity. It also defies the paradoxical logic of strategy, which says that the route to victory is doing exactly the opposite of what is expected by one's opponent. Unfortunately, the gods do like to play on mortal folly. Thus, at the end of the Cold War, which was a pretty giddily unexpected triumph of liberal democracy, heralding the end of history, it was said, they drew the first veil across the eyes of the defense establishments of the world in the form of, or of the Western world at any rate, in the form of Saddam Hussein, who offered up practically the ultimate fun war. First, he invaded Kuwait in August 1990 and declared its outright annexation, thus violating the one true no-no of post-Second World War international order. The international lawyer Sir Hersh Lauterpacht once wrote that If international law is in some ways at the vanishing point of law, the law of war is perhaps even more conspicuously at the vanishing point of international law. On the matter of the prohibition against the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, however, the United Nations Charter, from which that is a quote, specifically Article 2, subsection 3.4, is particularly perfectly clear. The assembling of an international coalition was relatively easy then, as was the establishment in the public consciousness of an unambiguously legally just casus belli, as both rested firmly on an ironclad United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing the use of military force. Second, Saddam parked two-thirds of his largely Soviet-equipped army out in the open, featureless desert to await the hammer blow of a vastly qualitatively and moderately quantitatively superior force that had just spent 3 generations training and equipping itself for exactly this sort of engagement, which was, I think you'll agree, a recipe for a truly splendid little war. Notwithstanding the pre-combat preparation of the American public by the Bush administration for potentially thousands of combat losses, victory for the coalition in the First Gulf War was never seriously in doubt, which is what led one French critic, the philosopher and controversialist Jean Baudrillard, to declare, somewhat mind-bendingly, that the war did not exist. But when the hammer blow did fall in the form of a 40-day campaign of aerial bombing, followed by a 100-hour ground campaign, the lopsidedness of the rout of the Iraqi military at the cost of a historically minuscule number of coalition casualties was surprising. The lesson taken by many was that the key to victory had been high technology, specifically information technology. In a nutshell, the theory was that knowledge is power. The side with the better microprocessors can best the side with the bigger battalions. Friction, the fog of war, chance as a fundamental quality of war, all that could be erased. The popular press and innumerable television documentaries greeted this development with a great deal of relish. I'll quote one just to illustrate. The world was awed and amazed when the first images shot by precision-guided munitions, or the aircraft that fired them, were broadcast during a post-strike military briefing the morning after the Gulf War began. No newspaper, no magazine article, no Discovery Channel special had given Americans a clue as to how effective surgical strikes using precision-guided missiles and bombs would be. Pictures of missiles striking parked aircraft, racing between buildings to obliterate a military target, or flying through the open window of an Iraqi government building, alerted the population of the world to the revolution in warfare brought about by precision-guided munitions. The future had arrived. The pride in the American military's battlefield accomplishments and the relief that a bloody quagmire had been avoided was palpable. To quote the president, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." In the wake of this episode, the American military, particularly but not exclusively, convinced itself that even if the Gulf War had not itself been a revolution in warfare, that it clearly pointed the way towards one. And it subsequently became what has been called the shaping event of American defense policy throughout the 1990s, to today, changing the whole course of American military thought. From the perspective of 2015, this seems ridiculous. To some it seemed ridiculous at the time, or at any rate substantially implausible. Nonetheless, the revolution in military affairs became a very hot and very powerful concept throughout the 1990s, despite it being a self-evidently self-indulgent, wishful daydream. Actually, information technology proved massively empowering of traditionally weak, non state actors, much to the expense of traditionally strong state actors, for whom the gains have proved decidedly more equivocal. Notwithstanding this, it is, as I said, it's impossible to deny the power of the grip of the idea on the imaginations of the major armies of the world. Admiral Bill Owens put the case for the revolution most emphatically in his book, Lifting the Fog of War. I'll quote from there. The computer revolution, if correctly applied, presents us with a unique opportunity to transform the U.S. military into a lethal, effective, and efficient armed force that will serve the United States in the 21st century. This is the American Revolution in military affairs. This new revolution challenges the hoary dictums about the fog and friction of war and all the tactics, operational concepts, and doctrine pertaining to them. Meanwhile, though, through the period between the Gulf War of 1991 and the post-September 11th invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003 respectively, Fun Wars theory developed another layer of seductive promise. Not only would high technology lift the fog of war, it would also, in the form of standoff precision weapons, dramatically reduce the need for mass, specifically the mass of large ground forces. There was much overlap in this line of reasoning with then fashionable thinking about demassified post-industrial knowledge economies and their supposed military equivalents. However, the thing being substituted here was not so much boots on the ground as it was will. The problem for policymakers was that they perceived from their own electorates the need to be seen to do something about tragic events abroad, which were beginning to impinge more greatly on public consciousness, it was argued, on account of the increasing ubiquity of global media. But their actual ability to do something useful in such conflicts was really rather limited, in part because no one had much appetite for the sustainment of casualties or great material expense in support of these efforts. The clamor nowadays to respond in some ill-defined way to the barbarous cruelty and aggressive Islamic chauvinism of Islamic State in the Middle East today reflects exactly the same pusillanimous combination of contradictory impulses. The trick then was to do something sufficient to mollify public conscience, but at the least possible cost. The result, and post-heroic warfare is probably the best catch-all rubric for a collection of related ideas, may have been cynical, even low and dishonest, to use the words of the poet W. H. Auden, of a completely different context, but it had a distinctively defensible strategic logic. The West, by and large, was content with achieving partial results in these conflicts because it was not directly threatened by them. Hence, the determination to obtain significantly different outcomes in them was proportionately mushy. And it became accustomed over time to the idea that waging modern war, to use, was essentially strategically ambiguous. In the words of the American General Wesley Clark, from whom in his book, Waging Modern War, he was the commander of NATO forces during the Kosovo War in 1999, which was something of a high point of post-heroism, as NATO fought that war entirely from the air. He wrote, "Though NATO had succeeded in its first armed conflict, it didn't feel like a victory. There were no parades, except by the joyful Albanians returning to Kosovo. The military and the diplomats within NATO were simply relieved that the operation was concluded, and they were absorbed in the next mission, working on the ground inside Kosovo." It could hardly have been more ill-suited, however, to the post-9/11 world, though the initial results of the phase of major combat operations in the Afghan and Iraq campaigns were highly gratifying. The military analyst Max Boot wrote in the pages of Foreign Affairs magazine, hailing the advent of a new American way of war, listing amongst its characteristics more or less all of the RMA tropes mentioned by William Owens. The story of the myriad subsequent failings and ultimate demise of the wars in both places, I probably don't need to cover in detail now. As one hard-hitting analysis by my former colleague Alex Marshall and his partner Tim Bird of the former, that is Afghanistan, concluded, there have been just two consistent themes in the Afghan campaign. First, the mismatch between the dominant policy fashions pursued at particular points in time and the cycle of events in Afghanistan itself. And second, the flawed execution of those policies, suggesting that even if there had been a closer alignment of approach with conditions on the ground, success, in inverted commas, would have been elusive. Meanwhile, the counterinsurgency debate will go on as it has, reproducing the same forgotten ideas and arguments as it has practically every generation for 100 years already. To my mind, a more fundamental failing came in the form of a second veil, which was the conceit that what have come to be called wars amongst the people could be fought without the engagement of the passions of one's own domestic population. Since 9/11, there can hardly be a single Western leader who has not uttered the phrase war of ideas to describe the context and the stakes of the war on terror. There's been a cataract flood of new doctrine on strategic communications, influence operations, information warfare, maneuver in the cognitive domain, etc., and so on. No good propagandist would use the term propaganda, though that would be the more economical and correct term to describe this collection of doctrine. But virtually none of this is focused upon the key population, the population whose beliefs and ideals bear the most direct influence on the sustainability of any campaign, the population at home. So we are enjoined endlessly to counter the extremist narrative. But what is the West's narrative? Not just for the purposes of countering the heinous philosophies at play in Islam's incipient civil war, what's the West's conception of itself? The truly strategically debilitating thing, to my mind, is that the West does not have one, or at any rate it is incapable at the present time of articulating one. Traditionally, strategic narrative, propaganda as one might and probably should call it, rests, as my colleague Nicholas O'Shaughnessy has written in his book Politics and Propaganda, on a combination of myth, rhetoric, and symbolism. Together, these are employed to achieve a common will, or as Walter Lippmann, also a noteworthy propagandist, called it an oversoul, a national mind, a spirit of the age which imposes order upon random opinion. There is no such thing today. What prevails instead is a multitude of narratives, variously contradictory, mostly incomplete, and generally unconvincingly rendered. In fact, not generally unconvincingly rendered, but consistently unconvincingly rendered. For case in point, read any statement by Prime Minister David Cameron on the war on terror, on the expeditionary campaigns within it over the last 5 years. Consider, for a less frivolous example or a less less political example, consider this. 49 countries have to date contributed to the ISAF mission in Afghanistan in one way or another, and every single one of them has been dogged by the same question. Why? Why are we here? For 48 of them, probably the biggest reason they were there was because the core of their national security policy is to act as deputies to the United States when it is in global sheriff mode. And yet, as former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates recorded in his memoirs a startling realization during a March 2010 meeting on Afghan strategy in the White House. He said, or he wrote in his memoirs, he recollected in his memoirs this thought. As I sat there, I thought, the president doesn't trust his commander, can't stand Karzai, doesn't believe in his own strategy, and doesn't consider the war to be his. Now, voters may be stupid, but they're not so stupid as to miss the gap between soaring rhetoric about necessary wars, wars that can and must be won, and the actual demands placed upon them as citizens in countries at war. If you ask no sacrifice of the people, they will have no major stake in victory. On the upside, they will have low or even no expectations of your leadership, as my friend Mark Safransky has written very eloquently. Do not raise their taxes or conscript their sons or even call for volunteers. On the contrary, enjoin them to be at ease, continue in their daily habits, shop as normal. In a less densely connected age than ours, this might have made sense. Now it doesn't. It's a recipe for losing wars. Specifically, it's a recipe for losing wars which are conceived as wars of ideas. To my mind, though, it is harder to find a more poignant critique of the whole period covered in this discussion than this extract from the memoirs of Major General John Cantwell, who was an Australian officer with 38 years of his service, encompassing 3 wars from Operation Desert Storm in 1991 through Iraq in 2006 and Afghanistan in 2010, where he headed the Australian contingent. And he recounted in this book, which is an electrifyingly good book in my view, his struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. He was particularly troubled by a gnawing doubt, and I quote from him. As I paid a final salute at the foot of yet another flag-draped coffin loaded into the belly of an aircraft bound for Australia, I found myself questioning if the pain and suffering of our soldiers and their families were worth it. I wondered if the deaths of any of those fallen soldiers made any difference. I recoiled from such thoughts, which seemed disrespectful, almost treasonous. I had to answer in the affirmative, or risk exposing all my endeavors as fraudulent. I had to believe it was worth it, but the question continues to prick at my mind. I don't have an answer. When your most senior commanders cannot construct an answer to the question why that is sufficient even to assuage their own private conscience, there's something quite wrong with your way of war. Obviously, the fun war is a chimera. It's facile to say who was more wrong, Weinberger or Schultz. The answer is neither or both. There were elements of truth to what both men said, as well as elements of untruth or of willful delusion. Delusion is too strong. I think it's closer. The more useful truth is that Clausewitz was right when he said that war comprised a trinity of chance, passion, and reason. The West has contrived with technology to eliminate chance and to replace passion in war, and failed on both counts, but succeeded wildly in blasting reason to smithereens. In London, over the last couple of days, in the midst of a Mediterranean-style heat wave, 1,000 armed officers of the Metropolitan Police, backed by special forces of the British Army, have been practicing their response to a multiple active shooter attack, a la Mumbai, Nairobi, Paris, too many other places to mention in a long, long list. They've been practicing largely in a disused tube station on the Strand beneath the university where I work. And as I wrote the notes for this talk, I could hear the sounds of automatic gunfire, the battle cries of the combatants, and the screams of the mock wounded coming through my open window. Helicopters clattered overhead, and I could watch police snipers bounding across the roof of Somerset House, which adjoins the building in which my office is located. It's not at all for fun. The eventuality for which these preparations are occurring is painfully, self-evidently plausible, and everyone knows it. The tragedy of the restless pursuit of the fun wars is that it has inevitably taken us back home to our own streets, our own schools, and hospitals, and universities, and public spaces. I really don't know what we're going to do about it.